first question is, how do you define public space, and who do you think gets to define public space, and who decides what rights apply in certain public spaces?
Okay. So really big questions. As a sociologist, I actually study race and place, and I think of not space, but I'm actually thinking of tangible places, and that'll help me with the explanation. So place in sociology, we see it as an empirical concept. It has bounded attributes, it's some unique location in the universe, it has meaning and investment, and putting public in front of place actually makes it even more significant, because you're saying that this is a place that should be open, it should be accessible. And so when you ask about who gets to define what's public, we have the government who can make definitions. If they own public property, then it's generally public. We have people who can define what they believe as, public space or place, but they may treat it as if it's private. So people who take over park benches and they're like, that's my bench, or this is my territory, or this public housing project, I really own this, but I don't own the deed to it. So there are many ways that individuals can kind of say, this is no longer public, this is private. But I think the kind of governmental ties to places and how people respond to that, if they kind of respect it and say, oh, well, this is not my private property, this belongs to everyone, or this belongs to the state. Or it may make it say, oh, it belongs to everyone, therefore I can claim it myself. So I think there are many ways that individuals can approach public space or public places, as well as the kind of general conception of what public place is.
Okay, thank you.
So currently, how would you think that these public places or spaces are being threatened in society?
I think there are ways we could see it as a positive story of expansion. So in New York, you have many more green spaces with Bloomberg, getting the cars out of Broadway, making it more pedestrian friendly. Like, that's where we can say, oh, there's been an expansion of public places or public space, or we have more parks, or we have more recreational spaces. But we can also see perhaps the limitations that are placed on public space. So if people say, well, that is a public park, but my kind don't belong there. Or as an adolescent, as a teenager, I don't belong in a children's playground. So there are ways that age can define who belongs where. There are ways that race can define. Like, do you feel as comfortable as students of color going to a public park on the Upper East Side as you would perhaps one in Washington Heights or in Harlem or on the Lower East Side? So I think geography plays a big role in our comfort, and it also plays a big role in how we're seen in space. Are we viewed as in concert with who we would associate with the place? Are we viewed as discrepant or out of place? And so a lot of my work is on adolescents and the kind of terrain that they have to navigate, both physical terrain and social terrain. And I think these ideas of who belongs where do you feel comfortable, all are impacted by race, gender, age, class, and so many other sort of identity markers that define how people use space or feel comfortable in spaces.
So I have a question that how does the ideals of security and religious freedom come into contact and opposition in public space?
The kind of religion piece is important if we think of, huge public spaces, churches, they're sanctuaries, they're supposed to be open in theory, but there are certain bodies who may see this type of church or this type of religious institution as theirs, but they are seen as having the freedom to choose and to be in these places. But the idea of more generally of freedom and space, I'm thinking about what's the need to march on Washington, the kind of symbolic notion of going down, marching to the Capitol steps. Like, that's the space where you should have a platform, you should be able to exert rights. Columbia's campus, the students, if they're going to, you know, have an action against the administration, they would know we take on the library, or we take over Hamilton Hall as they did in 1968. You know, so there are ways that gatherings on the plaza is not just recreation, but this could be a show or a show of force or a show of solidarity in a particular place. So once again, place plays such a role in allowing people to come together and to enact their rights to, you know, religious freedom or speech or any other assertions of fundamental human rights.
Well, recently there was a decision about the basis for stop and frisk being unconstitutional, and we as a group wanted to know what are your beliefs on the implications of this recent finding.
So New York is a very interesting site in that you have documentation of these stops and of these frisks, and that there was a law and a rule that police officers, if they made these stops, they had to document it. Chicago, a place that I've studied very closely in the work that I've done before moving to New York, these stops happen all the time, but they've never had to be documented. So I'm interviewing young people, you know, 14, 15, 16 years old, and they all talked about being stopped and searched, but, you know, they're just like, yeah, they just kept going. After they searched me, they didn't find anything. So New York has been remarkable in actually having the documentation that will allow you to act on it and to do something. So without the evidence that, hey, these stops are actually deemed ineffective and that they're not finding weapons that they're supposed to be finding, the targets are not quite right in terms of, you know, the hit rate. So we have a remarkable opportunity to really reassess this particular policy, and the fact that the ruling came down against it makes it so that the NYPD has to figure out how do we go about continuing to protect the public, but using different tools. Now, will they continue to use the same practices but not document it? That's one way to go. Or do we think about different practices that could be used that would make sense? The population I studied in Chicago, there were people who were very much in favor of the police coming in, being involved, but they wanted them to rightly target the bad persons. And I think the same could be said for New York. If people feel like this is a policy that doesn't wholesale say, you know, a full group of people is suspicious, but they're actually targeting people who may be about to cause harm, they may feel quite differently than they would just an extensive dragnet of, you know, a whole class of people by race and by gender and by age. So I think we have a remarkable moment in that this law has been cut down, but then there's still a lot of attention placed on the police practices moving forward. And with the new administration, with Mayor de Blasio and him bringing in Bill Bratton, who knows the kind of mistakes of Ray Kelly and the kind of critiques that that commissioner had, and he can think about what should be done now to gain the trust of the community, try to retain the trust of the community, but still go about keeping New York the safest big city in the country.
Thank you.
What do you think about the Trayvon Martin and the Jordan Davis decisions, and how do you feel like they reflect upon the Florida's Stand Your Ground laws, as well as how do you think that these laws can be changed in the future?
Okay. So, I mean, the biggest thing in this question is the fact that the victims we're seeing now as the people on trial. So you said the Jordan Davis, Trayvon Martin decisions. The actual people on trial are George Zimmerman and Michael Dunn. You know, so the decision was on them, but the victims were actually deemed to be suspicious, threatening, out of place, doing something wrong that could have validated the response by Dunn in the case of Jordan Davis and by Zimmerman in the case of Trayvon Martin. So that says a lot in that we're blaming the victim for perhaps the actions of the individuals who caused fatal harm to those same people. But how do they get openings to do that? I actually just taught a class, my racial disparities course, and we thought about racialized theories that would make it so that individuals might see their actions as warranted. So this stand your ground law actually implants in citizens the idea that, hey, if I feel threatened, I can, defend myself. I have the right to stand my ground and respond with even fatal actions. But what does it mean for the preconceptions that lead to these interactions, that Michael Dunn could believe that Jordan Davis and his friends in the car were threatening? Why is that? Is it because of race? Is it because of loud music? Is it because of age? Is it because of gender? And as a sociologist, you want to think if any of those variables were different, if they were white young males playing loud music, would he have felt as threatened? If they were older, so you can change these attributes and you have to think, what does it change about the intention that led up to these fatal consequences? And I think there is something very particular about the black body, the black male body, the young black male body, and that has been the focus of my research in really trying to humanize the way society may see these individuals as they're typed by race, age, gender, and place, but also getting from those who are subjected to, stop and frisk or potentially these actions of people like Michael Dunn or Zimmerman, how do they feel about this? How do they go about, presenting themselves in public places? Are they more likely to say, I won't wear a hoodie because someone may view me as suspicious, or do they say, they already view me as suspicious, I might as well dress the way I want? So how might they respond knowing that people have these suspicions about them? So stand your ground is an opening for embedding this idea of threat and not really sussing out how it's attached to identity attributes. And it allows it to be codified into law and people to just sort of act and not really think about the ramifications or how different groups may be differently treated on the basis of this. I think there will be opportunities for stand your ground to be contested in the 2014 election. So a lot of people are saying we've got to get at the Florida legislature, we got to change these state and local lawmakers and vote them out. So that will be one mobilization strategy. But the second strategy might be for us to think about these ideas of suspicion and threat, and how do we change that? How do we humanize the other? And that happens at the micro level between individuals, so you actually get to know people, but it also is a conversation worth having about dangerousness and larger assessments of how we view other people and then how you act on that. So I think we have a long way to go. I'm actually really both afraid and hopeful about what this means. I'm glad we're having these conversations about race and about crime and about threat, but what happens moving forward? Do we keep seeing the same cases, or do we figure out how to both change the laws and change the mindsets that accompany these fatal actions?
Okay.
What are your views on Arizona's SB 1070 law?
This is a larger issue of suspicion once again, and the ways in which we have given these larger powers to state actors, so the police in particular. And the fact that there's an opening to ask about one's status that may not be relevant to your, investigation of a traffic violation or some other kind of opening. But the question is, do we really trust the individual actors like police to abide by the strict letter of the law? They're not supposed to go after certain people to ask about immigration status. It's only a possibility for them to ask about it if they believe some other law was broken. So do we really trust that police will adhere to that, or do we think about the erosion of privacy and the fact that discretion on police may not adhere to those standards. So I think there's a slippery slope and there's some danger in terms of how we give these powers and then how people actually will use them. I think there might be a disconnect between what we want to happen and what we sort of inscribe in law and then what happens in practice.
Thank you.
Well, we as a group wanted to know if you or anyone else that you know has ever been a target or a victim of having your rights affected in a public space. If you're willing to share that with us.
I mean, that's a really big question. I think, you know, kind of low level, you go in a place and people are looking like, why are you here? Or you're walking behind someone on a college campus and they're looking nervous. So I think I've experienced that as an undergrad, not necessarily here as a professor at Columbia, where I've had to, you know, tell a student like, hey, I have a, you know, backpack that has Swift College on it just like you do. Don't be nervous, it's okay. So I think those low level incidents have happened, but in terms of not feeling comfortable in a public space, I mean, I think I'm really privileged in that I can kind of fit in. I think it's a function of, you know, gender that works in my favor, or perhaps me feeling comfortable in my body. But I know that there are many others who feel like they don't belong and they constrict their movements on the basis of fear about how others may view them, and I think that's a problem even if it's not someone that I'm connected to personally, but I think that's something we have to work on in terms of accessibility and giving people the mindset that, you know, this should be our space, collective space, but people don't feel entitled if their rights have been abridged in so many other ways, if they feel like they're, you know, not maybe their mobility in terms of education and employment and other aspirations has been limited, then sometimes you limit your physical mobility. You think about the circles where you feel comfortable. So I think that's really lamentable in our society that should be free and open and democratic. And we really have to figure out as individuals, as communities, as, you know, people at large, how we allow our American society to really fulfill its aims and fulfill the ideals that we set forward as a country, but how does everyone get the opportunity to realize it?
And just the last question is, how do you think that the past decisions for civil rights movements and cases will affect our generation in the future? And like, what major questions will we have regarding it?
I'm actually, you know, as a sociologist, you have to be a student of history, you have to think about context, you have to sort of see how things come together. I think we have a long way to go in terms of attaining equality on so many different grounds in terms of educational resources or opportunities, or even just giving people exposure to different experiences in different groups. But it's all relative. I grew up in Mississippi. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, and I always joke, like, you know, I was singing "We Shall Overcome," going to, you know, marches in Jackson, Mississippi as a 2-year-old when, you know, my arms wouldn't reach to, you know, grab the next person and sing these civil rights songs. But it's amazing to kind of see the iteration of fights that have continued. So with great triumphs and successes, I mean, we're not slaves, we're not, you know, people can vote. You have Obama as president, but we still have, you know, the prison industrial complex, you have stop and frisk, you have people's rights to vote being eliminated if they've ever served any time. You know, so there's still reflections that could be made to show us, hey, we still have a long way to go, even though we can delight in the progress that's been made. So I think for your generation, you're really going to have to figure out how we bridge so many inequalities that hinge on housing and education and employment, and then think about opening access to a wider amount of people. Because we've seen the reproduction of both inequality and the reproduction of advantage as well as disadvantage. So how do we kind of bridge those worlds together? I mean, it's gonna be huge in terms of the work that must be done on so many different fronts. But you gotta learn from the past and figure out what works and then apply those strategies